In this episode, I shall be presenting to you the details of the very peculiar case of the hunt for the Highgate vampire. If you have not heard of this case before, I can assure you the events we're about to analyse are well documented and are truly bizarre. Highgate Cemetery was established in 1839 and today is thought to hold within its grounds the remains of at least 170,000 bodies. By the 1960s, the cemetery had fallen into a state of disrepair, and reports from the time say that the grounds and landscaping was so unkept that visitors would have to fight through bushes and overgrowth to find family plots. Damaged tombs were also said to be covered crudely by tarpaulin, which was rotting over time. In that same era, the number of reported instances of grave robbing and vandalism increased. Many of these reports suggested that the desecrations were evidence of occult activity, devil worship, and acts of necromancy. With these reports came an increase in interest, and the local youths frequented the cemetery more and more, doing the things that youths did. They drunk, they fought, they did drugs, and they had sex, although not necessarily all in the same evening. It was an uncomfortable situation for the custodians and visiting families. More and more graves became damaged, and more the finger for much of the activity would reputedly lead back to occult and satanic groups. In time, and with media exposure, the two central people to this case file entered the scene. David Farrant and Sean Manchester are synonymous with the Highgate vampire legend, and it is their involvement at Highgate that we shall examine in this episode. Farrant was a self-described psychic investigator and white witch who founded the British Psychic and Occult Society in 1967. He made regular trips to the cemetery, usually by hopping over a wall. By late 1969, he saw an increase in vandalism, with vaults being opened, coffins being smashed apart, and the skeletal remains of bodies, supposedly at rest, scattered, desecrated, and in some cases, stolen altogether. Farrant claims that in late 1969, 2 reports were made to his British Psychic and Occult Society from people walking in or next to Highgate Cemetery of a, quote, tall, dark spectre. The first report came from an accountant who wished to remain anonymous. The accountant claimed to have had a first-hand encounter. As the lights began to fade, the man decided to leave, but somehow he got helplessly lost. Not being a superstitious person or believing in the existence of ghosts, he walked calmly around the cemetery looking for the gate. He suddenly became aware of a presence behind him. He swung around. At a distance of less than 6 feet in front of him was a dark spectre hovering above the ground. He found himself completely transfixed in the gaze of the phantom and completely unable to move. He quickly became drained of energy by what he believes was a hypnotic force that within seconds rendered him unconscious to time or his surroundings. So great was this force that he remained like this for several minutes, or what he believes was several minutes, when the spectre eventually vanished abruptly. Only then was the accountant able to slowly begin to regain his normal capacities. The accountant would later state that it was almost as if some force of terribly evil proportions had actually sought him out with the intentions of doing serious harm. Farrant commented that the accountant had seemed to him to be a sincere and logical person, and not the type liable to fantasy or exaggeration. Through all of this, the BPOS and general public were noticing something else. a number of fox carcasses were being found within the cemetery. The cause of death of a number of these creatures seemed unclear, and as they were considered a pest, no effort or cost was incurred in obtaining any professional examinations. However, in a small number of cases, there were obvious wounds or puncture marks to the neck. The fox deaths became intrinsically linked in discussions around the activity in the cemetery, and on the 6th of March edition of the Hampstead and Highgate Express, their headline read, "Why do the foxes die?" In all of the talk, there was speculation that a vampire was feasting on the fox's blood. But there were others who speculated that the fox's deaths tied to the speculated black magic rituals and their supposed need for animal blood sacrifices. One consequence of this exposure in the media was to attract unwanted attention to and from whomever had been performing their rituals within and beneath the cemetery. Farrant wrote a letter to the Hampstead and Highgate Express to ask readers to write in and share their experiences. The letter was eventually published on the 6th of February 1970 under the heading "Ghostly Walks in Highgate." Some nights I walk home past the gates of Highgate Cemetery. On 3 occasions I have seen what appeared to be a ghost-like figure inside the gates at the top of Swains Lane. The first occasion was on Christmas Eve. I saw a grey figure for a few seconds before it disappeared into the darkness. The second sighting a week later was also brief. Last week the figure appeared only a few yards inside the gates. This time there was long enough for me to see it much more clearly now, and now I can think of no other explanation than this apparition being supernatural. I have no knowledge in this field, and I would be interested to hear if any other readers have seen anything of this nature. A week later, in the February 13th issue of the paper, they published 4 responses which detailed the local tradition of spectres on Swains Lane. In the 20th of February edition, the paper made a plea for more material and published 5 more responses. Ghostly bicyclists, shadow men in top hats walking through walls, the wild Eggman, and Mad Arthur were all supposedly seen by locals. However, a few accounts were closer to the mark. My fiancé and I spotted a most unusual form about a year ago. It just seemed to glide across the path. Although we waited a little while, it did not reappear again. I am glad someone else has spotted it. I was convinced it was not my imagination. Miss Audrey Connolly, Ham and High, February 13th, 1970. The ghost will sometimes appear nightly for about a week, and then will not be seen again for perhaps a month. To my knowledge, the ghost always takes the form of a pale figure and has been appearing for several years. K. Fruin, Ham and High, February 13th, 1970. The BPOS investigation was underway, and explorations of Highgate yielded some shocking discoveries. The BPOS concluded that beyond doubt that satanic masses were taking place within the cemetery. Some of these were taking place in a maze of catacombs that ran beneath the cemetery. It became clear to the society that these rituals were not being conducted by drunkards and teenagers, and that a very real knowledge of satanic practices and black magic was being employed. One particular tomb, hidden deep within the heart of the cemetery, in fact a small mausoleum with a marble floor but which contained no coffins, had been converted into a small temple, and, judging from the inverted pentagram and magical symbols inscribed on the floor and walls, was in regular usage. But more significant still was the fact that the particular magical signs and symbols used could only be applicable in a rite dedicated to one of the most maligned deities to rule amongst the old kings of hell, and that such a rite could only be performed by the highest of adepts. No amateur would be capable of calling forth this deiform. The BPOS investigation didn't just unearth evidence of satanic worship. In the early weeks of the nighttime vigils, there were 2 more sightings of the creature. Sean Manchester had been making his own visits to the cemetery, and his interest was completely independent and separate to the BPOS and Mr. Ferrant's investigations that we have covered thus far. Manchester was the head of the British Occult Society and the fledgling Vampire Research Society, and in his investigations he also found evidence of an increase in fox deaths in the area, with evidence of lacerations around the throat and of being completely drained of blood. Manchester had been hearing of the accounts near the cemetery some time before the media frenzy, and had been embarking on his own investigations and had spoken to eyewitnesses. He had been cooperating with his own circle of like-minded people with an interest in the occult. One person of note that Sean Manchester was coordinating with was Peter Underwood, a well-known and respected investigator of the paranormal who has written many books on a wide number of topics under the paranormal and supernatural umbrella. Mr. Underwood was an authoritative consultant with numerous groups, and thanks to his rational and logical approach to his research, was trusted by media organisations. He was president of the Ghost Society from 1960 to 1993. Mr. Underwood passed away in 2014. In his Guardian obituary, they described him and his approach to his work as follows. He brought honesty and challenge to any discussion of the subject, once saying, "I have long thought that 98% of reported hauntings have a natural and mundane explanation, but it is the other 2% that have interested me." Mr. Underwood collected reports from numerous sources over the years in respect to the Highgate vampire, and in his book, The Vampire's Bedside Companion, The Amazing World of Vampires in Fact and Fiction, Mr. Underwood includes both his own notes and summarization of the events, plus a fuller account written by Sean Manchester himself. Preceding Mr. Manchester's account, Mr. Underwood offers an endorsement for Mr. Manchester's account. Ever since I became aware that the Highgate Cemetery was the reputed haunt of a vampire, the investigations and activities of Mr. Sean Manchester commanded my attention. I became convinced that, more than anyone else, this psychic consultant and president of the British Occult Society knew the full story of the Highgate vampire, and I am delighted to be able to include his remarkable contribution as a separate chapter in this book, for it provides a startling account of present-day vampirism by a researcher into the field of occultism who, like all true researchers, looks first for a rational explanation. Sometimes, however, no such explanation is forthcoming. The purpose of this segue is to offer the observation that Mr. Underwood was a very trusted researcher, and a very considered individual with credentials which far surpass my own, and that of many other commentators on this case. His endorsement of Mr. Manchester's account and research methods are noteworthy, relevant, and in my humble opinion, offer Mr. Manchester's account credibility. Sean Manchester notes in his own accounts that although he was a part of the search for what lay behind the sightings at Highgate, he thought there were plenty more people involved that he saw as more trained and seasoned in such matters, and in one interview lists Mr. Underwood as one such example. Anyway, Manchester and his fellow travellers had heard the local talk about the goings-on in and around Highgate Cemetery, which on its own was nothing particularly new, as we have covered already. Sean Manchester met with a number of witnesses who gave their own accounts of what they had seen and experienced, starting with two accounts from early in 1967. The first involved two 16-year-old schoolgirls who attended the local convent school. They were walking home at night having visited a friend's house, and their journey took them down Swains Lane. They were both intelligent and bright students, and as they passed the north gate of the cemetery, they were initially inclined not to believe what they saw before them. Amid the disorganisation and urban jungle of unkept foliage and graves in partial disarray, the girls witnessed the sight of ghostly apparitions of bodies seemingly rising from the grave en masse. In total silence and under darkness, they both picked up their pace, and only when they reached the end of the lane did they find their voices and confirm to one another that they had indeed both witnessed the same horrible scene. The girls' names were Elizabeth and Barbara. Elizabeth reached out to Sean Manchester some months after the event and offered this account. Normally, going past the cemetery, when you're just in a normal mood, you can feel the evil presence from the old cemetery. But this time my friend and I were coming down from Highgate village, and we were really in a good mood. We had just been to see a girlfriend and were happy. We were not talking, just walking. And we were walking down, having just passed the north gate, when we both saw this scene of graves directly in front of us. And the graves were opening up, and the people were rising. We were not conscious of walking down the lane. We were only conscious of this graveyard scene. Barbara was not keen on reliving the event or cooperating with a more detailed investigation, as the whole event frightened her greatly. She did confirm to Mr. Manchester that the event happened, and that Elizabeth's recollection of the event was consistent with her own memories of the incident. For some time after this, Elizabeth was troubled by a series of recurring nightmares. The thing all of these nightmares had in common was the presence of an evil entity which was seeking to enter via her bedroom window. She could see the face of this evil presence clearly. It was deathly white, just like the faces of the corpse she saw rising from the graves. Despite having a real effect on her, she said she felt slightly silly in the mornings, as a window remained intact, and seemingly no harm had occurred to her. The second event that had initially come to Sean Manchester's attention involved a young man who was out walking with his girlfriend, having just left a nearby pub in Highgate. Their usual route took them down Swains Lane, past the same north gate Elizabeth and Barbara had had their paranormal encounter. The couple were holding hands and walking casually when suddenly the girlfriend froze to the spot and began to scream at the top of her voice. Before them both was someone standing just a few feet away on the other side of the gates, and on his face was a look of absolute terror. The lovers watched on, petrified, when they then witnessed the being dissolve into the night air. This man and Sean Manchester had a mutual acquaintance, who upon hearing the story relayed it. Mr. Manchester persuaded the man to take him one day to the place the being had appeared and disappeared. The gates were locked, as at this time that section of the graveyard was permanently closed, even during daylight hours. Manchester arranged to meet the man again a week later, but this time at night. Even though Elizabeth and Barbara's incident had already taken place, Elizabeth had not yet made contact with Mr. Manchester, so this was the first incident that he investigated, and it was after meeting this man and seeing the site for himself that he resolved to examine the cemetery in more detail and also to begin to research the history of the surrounding area. Mr. Manchester's research showed that 700 years prior, a castle had dominated the place in modern days known as Highgate. A large site of what is now Highgate Village was then countryside, which was kept enclosed and used exclusively for the hunting of deer. By the 16th century, the castle was reduced to a heap of rubble, and the land became overgrown. Highgate Cemetery was opened in 1839, just 6 years after Highgate became its own parish. Owing to the rapid growth of London, cemetery space was a much-needed necessity, and Highgate soon became one of the most extensive and beautiful places of rest in London. By 1889, it had already become home to more than 100,000 bodies. Sean Manchester visited the cemetery during the day, entering via the main gate, which was the only gate in use to the general public at the time. He recalled, "I discovered that, sooner or later, whichever path you take, it will lead you to the large pulsating heart of the cemetery, the columbarium. This sunken circle of shadowy vaults and catacombs, whose shelves occasionally spill their mouldy contents, as if gorged by too many coffins, was clearly the nucleus of the atmosphere which pervaded the graveyard. Some of the tombs had their entrances bricked up, since the tranquillity was disturbed by strange goings-on in past years. Manchester turned his attention to other matters, and although aware of stories and encounters in the following years, did not devote too much time to the case until 1969, when he had a chance encounter with Elizabeth 2 years after taking her original account. Although it was a chance encounter, upon spotting Manchester, it was very clear that the young lady was keen to speak to him, so he offered her the opportunity to talk over a coffee at a nearby restaurant. Manchester recounts, "Although an intelligent and charming young lady, there was nevertheless a disturbing quality about Elizabeth. Her features had grown cadaverous and her skin deathly pale. She appeared to be suffering from a pernicious form of anemia. Elizabeth's voice was faint and at times barely audible. She told Manchester that she was working and had moved from her parents' home to a flat where she now lived alone in the Highgate area. She confided in Manchester that her nightmares had returned and were more disturbing than they ever were before, and she gave Manchester the following account of one such nightmare. Midnight had struck and I was slowly falling asleep. It is then I experienced not a dream but something higher than that. I became aware of the stillness of the night and something approaching. Although I sense danger, I cannot wake because I feel I am awake. All the time, there is a feeling of something drawing closer and closer. I feel both hot and cold and am saturated with perspiration. Something is outside my window and I am filled with a mixture of fascination and terror. I am too drowsy, too weak to lift my head. My legs and arms feel as if weights have been attached to them. I cannot move. Suddenly, I become aware that whatever is approaching is at the foot of my bed. Then its form grows larger and larger. At first, I think I see the face of a wild animal with glaring eyes and sharp teeth, but it's a man with the expression of an animal. The face is gaunt and grey. I feel dizzy and grow faint. Something touches me. It feels icy cold. There is a strange falling sensation, and I remember no more. These were all the details Elizabeth was able to reveal to Manchester, who felt that despite the conversation, there was a void between them. Manchester likens Elizabeth to someone who was sleepwalking, with long pauses of silence between them lasting several minutes at a time. Then she would suddenly return to life and look up and smile as if nothing had happened. Through patient questioning, Manchester was able to establish that Elizabeth was also experiencing headaches, dizziness, and occasional bouts of nausea. A follow-up meeting was agreed at Elizabeth's flat for the following evening. Upon arriving, Elizabeth introduced Sean Manchester to her boyfriend Keith, a tall young Scottish man, and although he didn't know it there and then, Keith was set to play an invaluable role in the coming weeks and months. Elizabeth made the drinks and Keith filled Manchester in about Elizabeth's background, her Polish descent, her strict Catholic upbringing, and that her father was a strict disciplinarian. Elizabeth's father was not taken with Keith, and Elizabeth, keenly aware of the quickly changing world around her, had decided she could not tolerate living under his rules, and so she had set about obtaining her independence. When Elizabeth returned to the room, she recounted a story from right after she had moved in. She had been sitting in front of a mirror brushing her hair when she became aware of a loud humming noise all around her. She became very frightened but did not know why. The noise grew louder and louder. Then, she became aware of a presence nearby. There was someone standing behind her, in her flat. She was too terrified to turn around. She closed her eyes and did her best to clear her mind and said a brief prayer, and eventually the humming noise relented and her sense of terror diminished. Other stories were recounted, some of a similar theme, and others of incidents and sensations from when Elizabeth would be in bed. It seems that at times she would take to bed only to have a sudden and strong urge to get up and go out. But as to specifically where, she could not say. There seemed to be a lot going on with Elizabeth, and the three spent some time going through everything. As Mr. Manchester was about set to leave, Keith also mentioned that Elizabeth had marks on her neck, but Elizabeth dismissed this as silly and did not wish to pursue that line of conversation further. Some weeks later, Keith got in touch with Manchester by telephone. He said he was sorry to trouble Mr. Manchester, but he was anxious as to Elizabeth's state of mind and health, and inquired if Manchester could make a visit, which he did, and visited them both that evening. Elizabeth's condition had indeed grown worse. She was hardly eating at all now, and had grown so weak that she struggled to walk. Her skin was loose and as pale as marble. Help from a doctor had been sought, and a prescription of vitamins and iron tablets was provided. Keith was exasperated, and it was he who then claimed to Manchester that he no longer believed that the kind of help she needed was anything that a doctor could provide, and claimed that, quote, she was being taken over by something. Manchester inquired what the young Scotsman might mean by this, and asked if he believed in such things as possession or demonic molestation, to which he simply shrugged, almost as if in disbelief of what he could see taking place with the young lady of his affections right in front of his eyes. Mr. Manchester had until this point not wished to ascribe a paranormal explanation until all other explanations had been ruled out, but he did confirm to Keith that he too was concerned that it seemed to him a supernatural force was influencing Elizabeth. Elizabeth barely spoke and sat quietly in a chair as the two men discussed what had happened in the intervening weeks. When Manchester sat near Elizabeth, he could now see obvious marks upon her neck. Upon realizing Manchester could see her wounds, she uncharacteristically expended a little energy to reposition her scarf to cover them from view. Manchester re-engaged with Keith and asserted that it was too early to be definitive about whether Elizabeth was subject to an act of demonic oppression or not, but was certain that she could no longer be left alone in the evenings. Upon the suggestion, Keith agreed to stay with her and help her through the situation. Manchester promised to give the matter his full attention and to research as much as possible. A few days later, Keith attempted to engage in conversation with Elizabeth about what was happening and gently suggest that some unnatural force or presence might be in play. Elizabeth refused to engage, prompting Keith to relay that he felt Elizabeth's conscious mind seems unaware or refuses to become aware that some other force was in control of her actions. He elaborated that he was observing her in a fight between two forces, which was often visible in her gestures and actions. He continued, "On Wednesday, after this confrontation, she ran out into the night. I followed and eventually found her outside the gates of the cemetery at the top of Swains Lane. She was staring through the iron rails as if in a trance. Several moments passed, then, turning, she walked back with me to the flat. I could see her flying from the thoughts I had presented to her, but my concern caused me to pursue the conversation even further. Suddenly, practically at the end of what I said, she announced that she had been trying to get out all evening, though in fact she hadn't. At this moment she became very upset, fraught. Imprisoned is probably the best word to describe it. Moments later, she changed and said it just seemed at the time as though I had been talking for ages. She can't face up to it yet, so she runs. A few moments after what is reported immediately above, I tried to explain this to her and that she must try and face it or it will take her. She then ran, and in the look she gave me, I knew it had taken her. She was back in the trance again. I slept on the couch in the room adjoining her bedroom. At about 1 a.m, I was woken by a stifled cry coming from the direction of Elizabeth's room. I jumped to my feet and found her gasping for breath, as if she'd almost been suffocated. There were specks of blood on her pillow. I comforted her as best as I could and remained there in her room until the daylight hours. Manchester made his way back to Elizabeth's flat, where he was greeted by Keith. Elizabeth was asleep and had refused food once again. Manchester witnessed the bloodied pillows and inquired of Keith how he felt the blood might have got there, and Keith speculated without certainty that maybe Elizabeth had coughed up some blood in her sleep. It was at this point that Manchester divulged that his chief suspect, which lay behind the supernatural assaults and which seemed to be taking control of Elizabeth, was that of a vampire. Keith, naturally some might say, did not believe it. He exclaimed that no one would believe it, and there was no such being. Manchester was well furnished with research, and some texts were provided which supported Manchester's assertions. Although Keith had been initially reluctant to accept some form of paranormal conclusion, he had, by the very evidence in front of him, reluctantly accepted that something he could not explain was at work. Upon hearing the word vampire, it instinctively triggered a sense of disbelief. But when Manchester walked the symptoms and account of Elizabeth's behaviour back, her anemic condition, the lacerations on her neck, the trance-like episodes, her being drawn to Highgate Cemetery, it was seemingly the most fitting conclusion. Manchester inquired as to what Elizabeth's room had been like when she lived with her parents, and specifically whether it contained Christian symbology like a crucifix. Keith confirmed it had indeed, and the whole house was adorned with crucifixes and vessels of holy water, and yet in the little flat there were none. Elizabeth had been under attack since her initial experience in Swains Lane, but her parents' home had provided suitable barriers and protection. Manchester concluded and prescribed that traditional vampire repellents were now needed to ward off the entity. Keith then also confirmed that Elizabeth had used to wear a small gold crucifix at all times, but in recent months had taken it off and never wore it anymore. Although Keith was bewildered throughout the conversation, he did resolve to do whatever was necessary to combat the unseen force that was attacking Elizabeth. Her bedroom doorway was sealed with salt, and a piece of linen was hung from the door which held a silver cross. Keith wrote out the first 14 verses of the Gospel of St. John and placed it beneath her pillow. Her neck wounds were treated with holy water, and the flat was also doused with liberal amounts of holy water, as the creed was recited in a loud voice. Manchester himself furnished her room with a large silver crucifix. Manchester warned that at night, should Elizabeth show signs of distress, that might be a sign that the vampire was nearby and attempting to control Elizabeth, and should any such sign present, it should be assumed the creature would wish to influence her to remove the protective controls that they had put in place, and that this must not be allowed under any circumstance. If an attempt to take control was obviously underway, Keith's role was to try and counter the force by reciting the following prayer. Let us therefore pray to Almighty God that he will avert from this province, and especially from this home, every ill, and that he may be pleased to shield us from the innumerable crafts of Satan, from the snares of the devil, and from all pestilence. Good Lord, deliver us. After just one night, Keith reported back, "Last night I did as you asked and sat in the armchair in Elizabeth's bedroom. While she slept, I watched as she writhed between the sheets, as if fevered, emitting strange groans and gasps sporadically. Her forehead was burning, and every so often her hands would search her throat for the cross she gave me to put there. I thought she would snap the chain on several occasions, and gently returned her arms to her sides and comforted her as best as I could. The cross around her neck definitely caused some consternation. Eventually, I dropped to sleep in the armchair. I don't know for how long, but suddenly I was awakened by a crash. A vase of flowers had been knocked over by the curtains, and a howling wind blew through the now opened window. Elizabeth was sitting upright in her bed, staring straight at the window. The cross was no longer around her neck. I sprang to my feet and made the sign of the cross, uttering the prayer you had given to me. I closed the window and went to Elizabeth, who seemed unaware of everything that was happening. The cross, still on its broken chain, was on the floor by the bed. I replaced it on Elizabeth and resumed my guard. There were no further incidents. Manchester kept up a routine of regular visits, and it seems that for the next week, Elizabeth was restless and often would request the removal of the measures of protection. At times, Keith would discover things had been moved and would replace or reposition them to maintain the barrier of protection as had been instructed of him, and he always ensured that everything was in its proper place before dusk. After that first week, Elizabeth returned to sleeping at night, and over the subsequent weeks there was an improvement in her demeanour and health. The anemia seemed to go away, the repellents seemed to be working, and with repeated applications of holy water, her neck did also eventually heal. There were many more accounts and many more incidents taking place in and around the cemetery. Sean Manchester mentions a man who walked down Swains Lane and saw something standing the other side of the gates, with what the witness described as a horrific and mortifying expression upon its face. They locked glares for what seemed like just a short while before the creature then seemingly dissolved into the night air. A teenager named Jacqueline also reported an incident. She and her brother had become interested about the goings-on in the cemetery and had made some visits there. In Jacqueline's account, she awoke one night at home. Something had awakened her from a deep sleep. It was icy cold and grabbing at her hand. In her half-awake state, she pulled her arm free, which was numb from the contact, and eventually she went back to sleep. In the morning, when she awoke proper, she found her arm wounded and scratched, as if she had ripped it free from something or someone's claws. The 22-year-old woman wrote to Mr. Manchester to proclaim her concern over her sister's behaviour, which included sleepwalking and suffocation during the night. One night, her sister, while sleepwalking, left the house and was later found in Swains Lane. The symptoms and behaviour were similar enough to Elizabeth's that Manchester made immediate contact and left his phone number with instructions to call immediately should the girl, Lucia, try and leave her bed once more in a trance. The next two occasions happened late at night, and the sister duly called, and Manchester made his way there to find Lucia staring with a blank expression out of her bedroom window, usually for not less than half an hour before eventually returning to bed, seemingly completely unaware of Mr. Manchester or her sister's presence in the bedroom. On the third call, the message had to be relayed by an intermediary to Manchester, who was out investigating. Although delayed, when he eventually got the message, he raced to the house immediately adjacent to the cemetery to find a note on the front door which had stated that Lucia had looked out of the window in a trance for about 20 minutes before heading for the front door, where she undid the locks. The note was left, and the sister was following Lucia, not attempting to wake her from the trance. Manchester pocketed the note and raced to Swains Lane, but there was no sign of either of the girls. He ran past the North Gate and into Pond Square. He chose to bear left towards Hampstead Heath, and soon caught a glimpse of them entering the forecourt of St. Michael's Churchyard. Lucia was still in a deep trance, and they walked together slowly down the left side of the church, and eventually passed through a gap in some railings and entered into the Highgate graveyard. Her sister grabbed Manchester by the arm and asked that they not proceed, and returned Lucia home. Manchester consoled her and stated that it was very important that he learn the location of whatever was drawing Lucia out at night. Lucia headed for the columbarium and managed to negotiate the rough and stony terrain very capably, despite seemingly not being conscious. It was dark, but luckily Lucia's white nightgown was somewhat visible in the faint moonlight. Manchester and Lucia's sister watched from a short distance. Lucia walked towards the catacombs and eventually stopped in front of a large iron door. She stood silently and motionless before the grand door for several minutes. After a time, she began to move slightly, but not from her spot. Instead, she raised her arms. She locked hold of the crucifix and chain around her neck and tore it off, dropping it uncaringly and dismissively to the floor. Immediately, a low, booming humming noise could be heard, and vibrations could be felt emanating from the catacomb. Lucia's sister became terrified and began to cry hysterically. Manchester reached into his pocket, where he had a silver crucifix. He threw it so that it landed in the space between Lucia and the big iron door. The instant the crucifix hit the ground, the vibrations stopped. Lucia gasped and woke from her trance. They aided her walk home and put her to bed, and the next day, when asked, Lucia had no memory at all of her late-night stroll. Manchester speculated in his mind that he might now have located the source, and wondered if what lay behind that imposing door was the unholy resting place of an undead creature. It was clear to Sean Manchester, other researchers and the local police that there was continuing and extensive activity going on in the cemetery that seemed to involve black magic and occult rituals. The evidence of this is said to have been extensive and undeniable. But what most concerned Manchester was the seemingly undeniable presence of an unholy creature of the night. With all the activity, it became something talked of regularly in and around Highgate, and as word spread, the number of people wishing to visit the cemetery by night steadily increased, often fueled by Dutch courage and the desire to see the ghostly spectre for themselves. Given the attention these accounts were getting, and that multiple individuals were actively researching what was going on, it was not long before Sean Manchester found himself in the media. On the 27th of February 1970, the Hampstead and Highgate Express published a front-page article based on an interview with Mr. Manchester entitled, "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?" In the article, Manchester extends his by now researched theory that a king vampire of the undead, who was originally a nobleman from Wallachia, near Turkey, walked again in modern-day London. His followers brought him to England in a coffin at the beginning of the 18th century and brought a house for him in the West End of the city. His unholy resting place eventually became a part of Highgate Cemetery. In later interviews, Mr. Manchester claims the title of King Vampire was used under journalistic license, but that the rest of the article was per his research. The article goes on to claim that the desecration of the graves in Highgate were acts of Satanism and an attempt by Satanists to resurrect the King Vampire. The article then details that he and his organisation believe in, quote, countering magic by magic, and that, also quote, we would like to exorcise the vampire by the traditional and approved manner. Drive a stake through its heart with one blow just after dawn between Friday and Saturday. Chop off the head with a grave digger's shovel and burn what remains. This is what the clergy did centuries ago, but we'd be breaking the law today. When the vampire claim was put to Farrant by reporters, he commented that, if the being he has seen turn out to be a vampire, I for one am prepared to pursue, taking whatever means necessary so that we can all rest. It was around this time that Farrant and Manchester were to begin a rivalry that stoked an enmity that would last a lifetime. Their distaste for one another played out very publicly in the media. The continuing publicity got Thames Television's attention, who made content for ITV. And in March of that year, they interviewed both Farrant and Manchester in a programme that aired on Friday the 13th of March 1970. Manchester warned Farrant on the show to stay away from the vampire, stating, "He goes against our explicit wish for his own safety. We feel he does not possess sufficient knowledge to exercise successfully something as powerful or evil as this vampire, and may fall victim as a result." The programme went out at 6 p.m, and by 8 p.m. of that same evening, Swains Lane was full of people who wanted to get a glimpse of the vampire, many of whom who fancied themselves as vampire hunters. By 10 p.m, many in the crowd were drunk, and it took an extended police effort to clear the lane and the cemetery. One witness was quoted as saying, "It was like the end of a Frankenstein film, when the monster was chased. People had weapons and looked as if they could have turned nasty if they had seen a tall, lean person lurking in dark clothing." All sorts of tales endure from within the frenzy, but one report tells of how a teacher from Essex brought his entire class to Highgate soon after so they could participate in the vampire hunt. Despite the ever-growing crowds, Manchester met with a team of about 100 in Swains Lane, which was supposed to constitute the official exorcism group. In the chaos, they tentatively made their way to the catacomb in the inky darkness. The night was frigid and the wind was howling. Try as they might, the group could not open the awesome door of the tomb within the columbarium. But Manchester refused to be deterred. The walls were damaged, and from a previous visit, the vampire hunter had spied a gap in the roof that was just about wide enough to admit one person at a time. However, it was a dangerous entry point, and Manchester and two associates had to be lowered by rope some 20 feet to the floor. Through decades' worth of cobwebs and dust, they searched the musty, damp interior for signs of confirmation that this was indeed the resting place of the undead. They found 3 evacuated coffins, but no vampire. They lined these caskets with garlic and crucifixes before sprinkling each with holy water. A circle of salt was established around each box, and being satisfied that no one was home, they ascended back up the rope lines and rejoined the crowds above. As they emerged around 12:45 AM, they were greeted by bright headlights, as the police had made their way inside. Manchester had permission from the cemetery's administrators to be present, but sent the majority of his associates home to aid the police's efforts to rid the cemetery of revellers. A dozen hand-picked observers remained with Manchester. At 2 AM, low booming vibrations began, and it felt like they were emanating from the earth below their feet. They grew louder and louder, then stopped suddenly. At sunrise, the tomb was re-inspected, and the coffins were as they had been left before, empty. On the front page of the London Evening News of the 14th of March 1970, under the heading "Satan Riddle of Open Tomb," Londoners would read, "Nearly 100 people joined into a vampire hunt at Highgate Cemetery today. Curious onlookers managed to scale the 10-foot wall in search of an open tomb. Several people scrambled back frightened, claiming they had seen something crawling in the dark. Anthony Robinson, aged 27, of Ostell Road, Hampstead, came to the cemetery after hearing of the torchlight hunt. I walked past the place and heard a high-pitched noise. Then I saw something grey moving slowly across the road. It terrified me. First time I couldn't make it out. It looked eerie. I've never believed in anything like this, but now I'm sure there is something evil lurking in Highgate." The efforts to quell the paranormal activity in the area had effectively failed. Despite continuing crowds of hundreds most nights, the supernatural activity in and around the cemetery did not decline, but continued on, bringing forward new witnesses to the papers and to those engaged in investigations. Farrant continued to bring groups into the cemetery at night, and they would perform their own rituals. He would stress that all such rituals were in accordance with white magic, as he was a white witch and would never perform any evil incantations. In August of 1970, a group of schoolgirls walking in the cemetery came across a decapitated corpse that had been removed from a crypt. The position of the body is said to have been just outside the grand door Lucia had stood before in a trance just a few months earlier. The Hampstead and Highgate Express of the 7th of August 1970 quoted a police source as saying, "We are working on the theory that this may well be connected with black magic. The body could well have been used for that reason." Even in the midst of stories that were shocking and scary, the news of a headless corpse being discovered prompted widespread fear and concern. Sean Manchester decided it was time to re-examine the cavernous catacomb. He had felt back in March that the columbarium had been the key and was disappointed to have not brought incidents to a close already. Once again, with assistance, Manchester was lowered into the tomb. The setting inside was much the same as it had been when they'd left a few months earlier, except for one obvious change. Where they'd left 3 coffins in residence in March, there were now only 2. Manchester got back in touch with Lucia that week and encouraged her to meet him outside the catacomb one afternoon. Lucia was understandably very nervous about the prospect, but eventually agreed. Manchester brought a team of 3 assistants, who were all well equipped with the necessary vampire repellents. Lucia was visibly nervous on arrival, and the team did their best to put her at ease. Manchester seated Lucia in the wake of the imposing door and began to act upon his plan for the day. With Lucia's agreement, he placed her into a hypnotic trance. The process took some time, as Lucia's nervousness prevented a quick transition into the required state, but eventually she reached the desired state, and Manchester began to ask questions of her. Initially, Lucia answered questions in her normal voice, but all of a sudden, her voice deepened and the answers stopped. In a deep, sinister voice, she began repeating,
"You should not have come here. You should not have come here. You should not have come here. You should not have come here."
Over and over again, she repeated the same line until Manchester inquired as to why they should not have come, to which the answer came in the same guttural scowl.
"Because evil has triumphed over good here."
Lucia became distraught and progress in the session stalled for a few minutes, but Manchester persisted and tried to reinstate calm so as to continue to probe her for answers. Her normal voice and calm eventually returned, and he asked her to recall the night she had sleepwalked into the cemetery. Instead of answering why she had walked, she began to say, "Yes, yes, I'm coming," as if she was being summoned by someone with authority over her. After a moment, she began to inquire within her trance, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" And each time she cried out in her search, she got a little more upset and agitated. Manchester motioned to his assistants not to intervene as Lucia got a little more restless still. Eventually she stood and walked to a different door nearby and began sobbing out front of it, crying out still more, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" Manchester then ended the session and brought Lucia out of the trance. He wondered if this could be it. Was this the new vault to where the creature had moved? A brief discussion was held, and in no time at all, the team of 4 had their shoulders pressed on the door and found that this door did indeed open. Manchester felt a rush of excitement. Last time he felt he was close, but he had to contend with the mob, the winter and the night. He wondered if the creature lay within yards of him, and if this time he would have the advantage of daylight. Inside it was dark, and as soon as the vault was opened, a wretched and foul smell met their nostrils. The vault was large and decaying coffins could be seen on the shelves. The vault listed its inhabitants by name outside, and it took only a quick count to see that there was one more coffin in place than there should have been. In scanning around, they all agreed that there was a single coffin at the back of the vault that was visibly in better condition than the rest, and which seemed to be out of place. On closer inspection, and in contrast to the others, it bore no nameplate to identify who lay within. The team all looked at each other, and with hearts pounding, they surrounded the coffin. For a moment, they were motionless, as if they couldn't believe what they were about to do. Just a few seconds later, they reached out and took hold of the lid, and with a great shared sense of trepidation, they lifted and removed the lid. There it lay. Before them all lay a body that appeared neither alive nor dead, at least in Manchester's estimation. One of the team broke the silence and half asked and half stated, "It's newly dead." But they all knew that the tomb was over 100 years old, and according to the inscriptions outside, there had been no recent emissions. Manchester knew what he needed to do, and placed a wooden stake above where he supposed the creature's heart would be. But upon doing so, the same assistant who had spoken first objected, and stated that such an action would be sacrilege, even grabbing Manchester's arm to encourage him to desist. To this assistant, the body was not so obviously the undead, and in this moment, the most unlikely but most human of things happened. A disagreement and a conversation as to the appropriate course of action broke out. Manchester insisted that this was the being they'd been seeking out, and that the stake was the traditional means of disposal. This was not an act of violence, but an act of healing to allow evil to be defeated. And although the team did not disagree with this, what the assistants did seem to agree with, and expressed to Manchester, was that on this particular day, the proper permissions to enter the vault and perform such an act had not been obtained. They had found the fanged creature immediately after the session with Lucia, and despite Manchester's obvious frustration, he relented and agreed to seek the necessary permissions from the cemetery's custodians. Despite this, there was a sense that they couldn't just close the lid and hope that it would be there when they returned, and so they sought of Manchester his expertise on what alternative measures could now be employed. At his direction, the lid was replaced and a crucifix was positioned on top of it. In the four corners of the vault, vessels of holy water were positioned, while lines of salt and bags of garlic were also strategically positioned. The doorway was lined with salt, and the four of them stood outside the door and prayed silently, asking for the strength and support to banish the creature once and for all. The team then formed a circle around Lucia, and Manchester began a spoken exorcism. White candles were lit to surround them, to form a boundary, and Lucia was instructed to remain within its confines. Manchester handed her a Bible open to Psalm 54. Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies, cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies. Manchester sprinkled holy water and recited prayers of invocation, making a sign of the cross between each. They pleaded for strength and intercession, before Manchester continued, O thou who dost answer the prayers of thy humble servants, strengthen these efforts in thy name to counteract the subtleties and evil mischiefs of him who is the devil's agent. Cause the forces of darkness to be overcome by the angels of light, for the sake of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And as the last utterance was breathed forth, the candles surrounding them flickered as if an unfelt draught swept past them. The light from the sun notably darkened slightly, and a quick glance was all that was needed to see that evening was drawing in. Manchester continued with gusto, facing the tomb, and with the loudest voice he could muster, he concluded his ceremony with the words, Go forth, thou deceiver, full of all evil and falsehood, the enemy of virtue, the persecutor of the innocent. Give peace, thou evil one, give place, thou evil one, give place to Christ. Immediately, the now familiar booming vibrations began emanating once again from the tomb. It was so loud that Lucia dropped the Bible she had been holding and had to be physically blocked when her instincts kicked in and she attempted to break from the circle. Manchester cried out, Begone, thou hideous demon, unto thine own place, and return no more to plague the children of Almighty God. And as he concluded this command, in a final dramatic assault upon the evil that lay within, he hurled the large crucifix that he had been holding throughout the ceremony towards the inside of the vault. Immediately as the crucifix landed, the booming vibrations stopped, just as suddenly as they had started. The crew stood silent for a few minutes in their circle. All any of them could hear now was silence. None of them dared to move. A peace seemed to fill the air around them. At the recommendation of Shaw Manchester, the cemetery's authorities bricked up the vault where the spoken exorcism had occurred soon after the event. It was to the hope of many that this was to be the end of the supernatural events in the cemetery. Unfortunately, it took but a short time for incidents and sightings to start up again. Many of Manchester's peers seemed content that the job had been done, but Manchester knew it could not be the case, as the stake had not been struck. The vampire was on the loose, and no one could say for sure what would happen next, and to who. In his write-up of the events of 1970 for the Vampire's Bedside Companion book, Manchester states that within a week of the exorcism, a man was found in the cemetery, having seemingly sustained vicious neck wounds, who eventually died in hospital. The rivalry between Manchester and Farrant continued in a very public way, and almost boiled over in 1973, when, to the delight of those who were taking a keen interest, a magician's duel upon Parliament Hill in Hampstead was announced for the 13th of April. However, the duel was not intended for the general public, only for the two men and their closest companions. But word of the expected duel got out, and fueled much interest, gossip and innuendo. The duel never took place. One of the tabloids learned that Farrant intended to slaughter a cat in front of his assembly of naked witches, and naturally the RSPCA and the police took interest. Farrant subsequently commented, "I have been approached by the police and have been advised not to go ahead with the duel, but I can't back down now. The cat, probably a stray, will be anaesthetised before it is slaughtered. When I agreed to take part in this duel, I didn't realise there would be so many difficulties. At these ceremonies, our members are usually naked because the ritual has to be done authentically. I am a white witch and do not use evil powers." In any case, Farrant stayed away from the event fearing he might be lynched, and Manchester was content to voice a spoken exorcism in front of the assembled media aimed at nullifying the powers of Farrant's magic. One night later in 1973, Farrant was found by police naked at an abandoned house, whereby he informed them he was performing a Wiccan ceremony to rid the place of its hauntings. He was hauled before a judge but let go with a warning. The police were abrupt with Farrant and his close friends, and this seemed to stir yet more animosity in him, and as such, he began mailing voodoo dolls to the authorities. He was arrested again on suspicion of damaging grave sites in Highgate, and although absolved of that specific charge when someone else came forward, in investigating Mr. Farrant, the police found photos of other damaged graves in his possession, and charged him with additional counts of grave desecration, and also for the mailing of the voodoo dolls. Farrant was sentenced to a spell in prison. He admitted his role in the mailing of the voodoo dolls, but maintained his innocence in regards to the charge of vandalism of graves. For Sean Manchester, the Highgate vampire story was not yet concluded. He and select associates continued to track sightings and reports. There must have been a sense of frustration in having come face to face with the creature, and in his efforts to stop it having been unsuccessful. Eventually, in 1974, they were able to track the creature to an abandoned Gothic-style mansion very close to the cemetery. As they had done in the tombs before, they entered with great caution and carefully searched all over the long deserted building for the creature. In the cellar below the house they found a coffin, which Manchester identified as being the same entombment in which the vampire had been found 4 years earlier. One of Manchester's associates called Arthur departed temporarily and rushed to get all of the necessary tools needed to deal with the beast once and for all. A plan was formulated and put into action. The casket was dragged upstairs, outside of the house and out to the grounds. This time the creature would be dealt with once and for all. Flushes of dawn were evident, and so the lid was opened, and the creature once again exposed. A near unbearable, putrid stench emanated out and met their noses. It was even more distorted and repulsive in appearance than it had been all those years prior. Its eyes burned with rage, yellowish to the edges but red in the middle like the fire of perdition. Its mouth was set in a cruel, snarling position, and traces of blood, presumed to be from its last meal, were evident on its sharp teeth. The creature's nostrils flared with anger and contempt for the humans who had disturbed its slumber. This time, it was unquestionably aware of their presence. This was no romantic, curse-bound hunk of modern fiction. It was an entirely evil and demonic being that exists as the antithesis to the highest ideals of human and Christian morality. Sean Manchester proceeded to do what needed to be done, and with the mightiest blow he could muster, he staked the creature for its cold, miserable heart. In doing so, the monster's body cavity immediately caved in on itself and changed in colour to a filthy brown. Within moments, the body began to dissolve and collapse in on itself, and a slime oozed in the base of the casket. Manchester then employed the chief weapon against such a creature and set fire to the remains within the casket to ensure the remnants of the body and what evil it contained were completely and utterly destroyed. The fire took instantly and burned for hours, and when it was done, even the tiny shards of bone which remained were ground down, and all traces of the remains and ashes were removed from the site and disposed of. Since that day, the sightings from within Highgate have ceased, and those witnesses who had reported recurring effects, nightmares and nighttime encounters all soon concurred that associated activity was no more. It was as if a great burden was lifted from all those who had been under the yoke of terror that the creature had visited upon them. The vampire's reign of terror had ended. This episode of UK Paranormal Files has been an honest attempt to pull together as much of the relevant information regarding this incredible story as was possible. I have attempted to incorporate details for this story as closely as possible from how it has been relayed from primary accounts given by both David Farrant and Sean Manchester. And where possible, I have also incorporated information from independent sources. However, such was the wealth of information available, it is likely I have missed information some people familiar with the case will consider relevant. I have attempted to employ some measure of brevity in my reconstruction, and in doing so I may have understated or underrepresented the number of eyewitness accounts and the involvement of some other individuals. The fact is, when I make my episodes of UK Paranormal Files, I try to balance twin motivations. On the one hand, my intention is to inform and relay details about interesting paranormal stories and events, but on the other, I am aiming to provide some measure of entertainment. So I'll simply say this, that this was my best efforts endeavour to meet those twin goals, and invite discussion from viewers and anyone with their own first-hand accounts to leave a comment below. Unfortunately, I am almost certain that there will be a small number of people with first-hand knowledge of this story that will find at least some issue with this account. The intent of this video has not been to render one man's version against the other, or to exclude any other person's perspective, but simply to retell what I consider, at its centre, to be a fascinating story of the paranormal for the benefit of anyone who might not have heard it before. And as I'm alluding to, in analysing the talking points and the facts of this case, it seems we must start with the two central characters and acknowledge the enmity between them, and to which extends to their supporters and rivals. Until Mr. Farrant's passing in 2019, it seems the two men remained embittered towards one another. Their lives became intertwined through the creature that stalked the Highgate cemetery. Neither man seemed willing or perhaps able to make peace with the other, and a lifelong rivalry characterised by barbs and ridicule followed. It is this rivalry which has taken on a presence of its own and overshadows the account, and sometimes distracts attention away from the central facts. From the point of view of the modern observer, it is a shame that a story so incredible as this one, with so many eyewitnesses and with so much effort employed by so many that the central integrity and temperament of its witnesses is even questionable. They have been the chief interrogators of each other's motives, actions and claims ever since. In doing so, this story, despite its wealth of eyewitnesses, is promptly dismissed by skeptics, and caricatures of both men are easily and readily constructed. It is also clear that, for a time, their rivalry extended into a form of competition, which leaves open some questions as to how far either man might go in their quest to prove themselves the superior individual, psychic, magician, or indeed vampire hunter. In doing so, the fair-minded person might question to what extent the story, from any perspective, has been embellished or fabricated outright. Farrant's life after Highgate is well documented and details available online, both in his own words and from those who knew him. In what I have seen and read since then, there is little which leads me to think he was an individual who exhibited behaviour that I would personally find easy to trust. As for Sean Manchester, there are many detractors of his on the internet too, and judging by the comments under his Amazon books, many have not received his work enthusiastically. There are many forums in which his account and character is vilified. It is clear as I move from site to site, however, that much of the criticism of him strikes in a similar tone, and it doesn't take too long before it all sounds very much like it's coming from the same few voices. Sean Manchester took a different path, one that is long and storied and perhaps better served from hearing from him. But he did somehow find a route from leading the British Occult Society and Vampire Research Society, and found himself ordained into the Old Catholic Church, which is an order which broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1850s. An interest in the occult sure seemed odd for a bishop, but God does draw in people with flawed characters to work for him. There is not much that is kind written or spoken about Mr. Manchester, and he has been quick and forthright to defend his account and his reputation. There is a website entitled Friends of Bishop Manchester, which was set up in 2010, that purports to seek and to defend his positions and proclaim their friendship, and it is from their site that some useful research materials were gathered which helped me pull this video together. As I alluded to a few moments ago, despite the enmity, there are parts of the story they do not contest, and when we cut through the dislike and contention, the two men both seem to attest the most central planks of this account. The two men were compelled to investigate and took reports from first-hand witnesses. They both saw evidence of widespread grave desecrations and of occult activity taking place in Highgate. They both found evidence of animal mutilations, notably of foxes. They both, in the early 1970s, contended that a paranormal entity was behind the eyewitness sightings, and for a time at least concurred that it was likely a vampire. They both publicly declared their intent to bring an end to the creature's actions. They both came face to face with the entity and attested to its evil presence and intents. My final thought on the pair is a hypothetical one. Suspend any scepticism of this case thus far for just one moment, and suppose that everything I have relayed is true and happened. If there is a demonic presence interacting with us humans, be it in the guise of vampire or not, then it, or the forces it represents, would surely not have ended its influence upon those two men when the creature was staked and burned. To accept the account of the Highgate vampire is to also accept the existence of the forces which lie behind it, and those forces must have continued to manifest in the lives of both men. Evil such as this thrives off of chaos and ill regard between people. Two men, any two men, whether of excellent reputation and moral fibre, or as sinful and vulnerable as any other man, if united in purpose to confront evil, will be open to the full forces and influences of that same evil. What I'm getting at is, the long way around, if their accounts are largely truthful, then their dislike for one another should not necessarily be a factor in considering the veracity of the case facts. They may just be two souls never destined to get along, or driven to dislike and distrust each other by an unseen force, which may itself have been endangered by their intent to confront the vampire and enraged by its eventual destruction. If we move past the central individuals in this case, there are a lot of proof points that are worth recapping that would lend to the notion that there was indeed something lurking in the murky, unkept undergrowth of Highgate Cemetery. There were multiple eyewitness accounts over many years. In these accounts, similar behaviour and traits were ascertained that strongly suggest that the being was a vampire. It was described as a tall, dark spectre with glowing eyes. Facial features were often discernible. It was described as an evil-looking creature lacking human warmth or compassion. Its eyes were said to glow by many eyewitnesses. Up close, Sean Manchester described its eyes as yellow on the outsides but fiery red in the middle. Repeated accounts assert some form of psychic abilities, and some people independently witnessed other people in trance-like states. Some people affected found the event led to recurring encounters at home, nightmares and anemia. The being may well have been entering Elizabeth's bedroom at night and drawn blood from her neck. There were numerous fox carcasses found around the cemetery, some of which showed evidence of massive blood loss in conjunction with bloodied neck wounds. There was an observable reduction in activity when crucifixes, holy water and garlic was in place, and an increase when these measures were lessened or removed. The being was observed by multiple eyewitnesses as vanishing or dissolving into the night right in front of their eyes. Sightings came at night. Both times the creature was located by Sean Manchester, it seems it would take to a coffin during daylight hours. It escaped destruction initially, however, was eventually dispatched by means traditionally associated with vampire legend. This was no Hollywood or Hammer Studios vampire. This is neither David Boreanaz nor Christopher Lee. If you are familiar with the account of the Crogling Grange vampire, the characteristics are very similar to the Highgate vampire. In both cases, the cemetery is described in various states of disarray and unkept. And if you haven't already seen my video on that, go watch it after you finish watching this one. Sean Manchester claims to have traced the body back to an 18th century nobleman from Wallachia. The exact identity has never been confirmed publicly so as not to cause disturbance to his living heirs. However, this creature seems not tied to the earthly realm, nor was any trace of humanity observable. It seems there is no contention from any source to the fact that there was a lot of occult activity going on in the cemetery at the time, and all sources claim to have openly discussed the matter with the police at the time, who were minded to try and find whoever it was in an effort to stop further activity. If you are still with me, you will have probably either made your mind up already, or hopefully resolved to go research this story in much more detail. Neither Sean Manchester nor David Farrant have been shy in giving interviews, and there are a good number available on YouTube. I'll link to some of these in the description of this video. As I researched this story, and the more the details of this case pass back and forth in my mind, the more I become inclined to think that the big personalities of its chief witnesses are of less consequence to the veracity around the central facts of this account. For some, their rivalry might be the chief ingredient for what makes this story entertaining. But for me, it is the fact that there seems to be a somewhat plausible account of a vampire being in existence in the recent years of London. And so if you strip away the hostility, you are actually left with a paranormal tale which ran several years and had many corroborating eyewitnesses. And when looked at in that respect, it is hard for me to dismiss the Highgate vampire. I know that for many people the possibility of the existence of vampires is impossible. Some of these people might argue that alternate explanations lie behind and have become confused with vampire sightings, such as people's lifestyle choices, sexual proclivities, and occasionally an unfortunate illness. This is before we add in influences such as from fiction, religion, and good old-fashioned pub talk and campfire stories. But here we have some very explicit accounts from multiple individuals, and for over 4 decades, the accounts of its chief witnesses and those they spoke to and interviewed have remained steadfastly consistent. As someone myself, who has had both the fortune and misfortune to have seen through the veil, and know that there is more to the world around us, and know that at least some of the publicly available accounts of the paranormal must have validity, there is much to this account that makes me think there is something to it.